My name is Ted Eckers. I'm the president of the St. Louis Park Historical Society. Thank you so much for coming out, and thanks to Lenox for hosting us. Today, what we're going to do, we're going to give a kind of an overview of St. Louis Park history. Jim Robbins, who's a trustee of the Historical Societies, will give that presentation. And then at the end, after that, maybe we'll break for a few questions about that history, and then that'll be kind of the entree, and then I'm going to come back for a dessert and do 10 fun stories of St. Louis Park. And maybe some things you haven't heard, or maybe a couple things you have, but just thought they were fun and would be a nice way to end things up. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jim, and we'll get started.
Thank you, Ted. I'm so glad to be able to do this, share with you and show what we have about the wonderful history of St. Louis Park. My name is Jim Robbins. I live in Minnetonka right now, but as I go through the presentation, I grew up in St. Louis Park at the great time, as I said to this lady here, in the 50s and 60s. So some of this is real to me, as real as a bicycle on a tar road and a popsicle stick. So St. Louis Park. We're going to focus on some themes: commercial, industrial, residential, schools, and transportation. The area was first surveyed in 1884. The movement to incorporate began in April 1886 with the St. Louis Park Land and Improvement Company. That included 5 men from Minneapolis, plus Joseph Hamilton and O.K. Earl from the future village. Earl Hamilton and George E. Goodrich conducted a census in August and found a population of 350 people, 45 families. That's in 1886. Now, Mr. Hamilton built this house at 5900 Goodrich Avenue. That house still stands. He was the first mayor of St. Louis Park. He built the first general store and became a home builder. He built commercial and residential buildings. Here is a map in 1886, and I told you 350 people. Notice the east-west development there. You see Minnetonka Boulevard, Excelsior Boulevard, one place I used to live, and you can see 2 train lines. At that time, St. Louis Park had 3 schools: Pratt, Northside, and Manhattan Park. Early days in St. Louis Park. This became an industrial city. Here again is a picture of an important person in our history, T.B. Walker. This is a project. It was a very impactful development project, 1890 by T.B. Walker, who with other investors like Thomas Lowry, you know Lowry Avenue, and Charles Pillsbury, built up 1,700 acres of land in the heart of St. Louis Park. It takes 2 years just to replat that land. Now, their vision of these people was to make an industrial city much like the Pullman had done in Chicago. In the middle there, you see the industrial arc connected to the railroads, and the surrounding are many hundreds of housing units for workers, future workers. Before it could come to reality, though, the financial panic of 1893 happened. Oh boy, I remember that one, huh? That's the one. Forcing Walker to sell off what he could. But he had a lasting impact on residential, commercial, transportation, and schools. Here's Walker. Walker managed to build some homes for the eventual workers, and you see some of them here. These are called shotgun houses, were built in the South Oak Hill area and Elmwood neighborhoods. There were 2 rooms down, 2 rooms up, and a side entrance and a privy out back, and some of them had a double lot so you could even grow a garden. About 100 were built, and you can still see evidence of them, though most have been modified over the years, have been rehabbed. The industrial circle is the other big impact, and though Walker has run out of money and isn't able to invest, many of them did. The businesses that started then included the Minneapolis Jarless Spring Carriage Company, which I don't remember, I don't think, Minneapolis Malleable Iron Company, Monitor Drill, and others. Most of the commercial businesses at this time were local grocers like Swenson's and Radine's. but we also see the first village non-groceries. In Doc Brown's barber shop and pool hall, and there, you can see up there, there's a pool hall there. See the guys with the caps on? Swenson and Rodine Grocery. Now the other thing is, and I know you know this, they went out of business when I was a little kid, streetcars. In addition to railroad access, another aspect of Walker's transportation plan was a streetcar that ran up Lake Street. You know where Lake Street is. Streetcars had a great deal to do with the population trends in the young village. In the days before automobiles, those who worked in town depended on the trains and streetcars to get them to work. Walker's streetcar made it possible for businesses to carry on along its tracks and fostered construction of homes in that area. The map of 1910. In 1910, believe it or not, there were 1,743 people, 1,700 people, about 5 times the population 24 years earlier. Remember I said that was about 350. On the map you can see the approximate area T.B. Walker plotted, which is the center of industrial, commercial, and residential growth. And then you can see in there the trolley line. 3 new schools have opened, but Pratt and Manhattan have closed. Again, these schools are Lincoln. Lincoln was 1889. Oak Hill, I was alive when Oak Hill was still a structure. Maybe some of you were. And Fern Hill. Now, Fern Hill was at 1905 Minnetonka Boulevard. I will just pause here. It was actually renamed Park Hill after Fern Hill was built. This building was built, as it says, in 1905. I was a second grader in 1954, and when they used to have, we're going to have a fire drill. And I'm on the 2nd floor. And I go down a side staircase or a side exit ramp that's connected to school with the rustiest metal I've ever seen. Can you get this? I said, come on, Jim, go down. I'm holding my little hand, you know. And I was scared to death, but we did what we were told. I went to grades 1 through 3 at Park Hill. That was a very, very old school. Now, the next big thing that happens, and it is big, in 1912, T.B. Walker donates land for a high school to be built. They wanted to name it Walker, but it remained simply the high school, and then it became Central. There is the core of the building right there. I went to it as a little 7th grader many years later. Now, of course, it was added on to, but that is your original high school. Okay, here we are at Dan Patch. The Dan Patch line, 1915. And we're just at World War I here now, isn't this, as we go along. Another significant development then it shaped the city happens in 1915 when M.W. Savage builds what was supposed to be a passenger rail road from Minneapolis to his racetrack in Savage, where his famous racehorse Dan Patch ran and was the best one around. Just a year later, though, they were running freight using steam trains, which left behind track oily smoke that clung to laundry hanging in backyards. Wouldn't have been a good time to be a kid then, I bet, huh? This is 1916. The Republic Creosoting plant closed their Minneapolis plant, and guess where they moved? They moved to St. Louis Park. Now, you know that that was a big deal. When I was a little boy, and I was trying to decide where my girlfriends lived, if I went far enough west, I could come to that place in Louisiana and smell that creosote plant all the years I was growing up. I see some nodding heads there. And we thought, oh, it's just industry. 50s and 60s, we didn't know. And as the notes say here, tremendous contamination, and it was one of the first super sites in the United States. Not a very pleasant legacy, is it, for our city, but that's what was happening then, and it was happening all over the country, and we had it right there in St. Louis Park. There it is. Republic Creosoting, 1916. School growth, aha, here we are. So the small population led to a building boom in the 1920s, the roaring 20s. Several schools were built, and here they are, Brookside, 1921. Lenox, that's this school right here, 1925, and Elliott, the northeast part of St. Louis Park in 1926. These schools, I dare have to remind you, were certainly in effect when I went to school, and I was on a basketball team. We used to have a traveling basketball team. We used to play at Elliott, and I just thought it was an old school. What did I know? Coming from Park Hill, almost falling down the stairs, it looked good to me. So there's your schools. There's the beginning of the schools anyway. Here's your small businesses, like Brookside Grocery, Freeland Grocery, and of course you can see here Al's Liquor. We all remember Al's Liquor. Many of you know the 1920s was the time of our failed Prohibition Amendment. They found ways to get around it here as in other parts of the country. Al's Cafe was deemed to be a confectionery store. It was called a confectionery store, but you could get a drink downstairs. And I bet you a lot of people did, don't you think? Now we're going to go to the 1930s. Here's a map in 1930. Look at the population now is 4,700. Now, and that's a population. Remember that a lot of the growth comes later, and this city is right next door to Minneapolis, and it says, boy, they're getting big. They're almost 5,000 people. Now, at that time, 4 schools had been built, the high school and those 3 schools I mentioned, Elliott, Lenox, and Brookside. Another factory and a railroad emerge, and the bars and gas stations start to accumulate on Excelsior Boulevard. I live on Excelsior Boulevard today in Minnetonka. Big development for us, 1934, Highway 7 is built. I just live a half a mile from Highway 7, and and when I was a young kid, I thought, well, this highway's been here for a long time, but it was modern. I don't know if you can see this, but yeah, I guess you can. Highway 7 at Wooddale Avenue, St. Louis Park, Minnesota. And that says, opposite the new high school. New high school. There we are, huh? And see the cars, aren't they? I don't know that that's 1934, but that one looks like it could be in 34, doesn't it? Okay. Now, the other big thing that happens, and this is near and dear to my heart, is the construction of Highway 100. Now, as many of you will remember, during the 30s, we were in the Depression, and there was things called, the New Deal had programs, and one of them was called the WPA, Works Progress Administration. And I know that many of those people in the Works Progress Administration built that highway. For some of you, I lived a block from that highway, guys. It's called Highway 100. It was called the Beltline, and my mother called it Lilac Way Drive. There were lilacs on that highway from my house, remember that? All the way up to 100. So we're going down Lilac Way Drive. You can see this is the park side right here, right? That's Minnetonka Boulevard. There's Highway 100. There's a family, and that family is not 1950. Well, maybe they are, but they're certainly not today. We may get into that later, but that park that you're looking at is what was called at that time Treasure Island. A park right across from Toledo, where I lived, and right on the border there of Highway 100. We had our school picnics at Treasure Island for many years. Highway 100's a big deal then. That's a major connecting belt line, if you will, for the western suburbs, especially in 1939. And then we have shopping centers, and here we come. 1941, Lilac Way Shopping Center. There it is. I used to get my shoes over there when I was a young kid, Lilac Way Shoe Store. See the water tower? So, and that is the beginning, folks, of what we call a strip shopping mall. It's very small, but that's what they're looking about. It's on Excelsior Boulevard, right across, as he said, from Miracle Mile. And now we're through with the war, and we have the post-war housing, and of course, that was a big deal. The first development was in 1934, the creation of the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA. Again, that was a New Deal program. There were 1,900 homes were built during the village in 1939. Now, that's before the war. Now, in 1940, after the war, holy mackerel, are we going to build houses here, other parts of this metropolitan area, and all over the country as the people come back from the Army. Growing up, when I was a little kid, I said, well, yeah, I know the war's over. I didn't appreciate, and maybe neither did some of you, what the big deal that this tremendous pressure on communities as these people went, you know, and one of it was housing. They had to build houses. We're going to talk about that a little later here. Veterans poured into the suburbs. I mentioned that most jobs held. Well, the veterans held jobs, but they wanted better housing, they wanted better schools, and they were quickly going to develop families. Holy moly, were they going to develop families. So here we're going to get to 1950. There's a picture probably of a veteran and his family, and there's an old, I love those old cars, huh? Okay, now here we are in 1950. Population is 22,640. And you can see a plot of the land. Now I'm here to tell you that was a lot of people in 1950. You go back and when you go home and you look at the populations of Richfield, Edina in 1950, they won't be anywhere near 22,000. So here we go with this population. I was 3 years old. We put that down. So growth, as in other words, you're seeing the effect of the beginning of the baby boom. And St. Louis Park responded with, as Ted helped me out with, Miracle Mile Shopping Center. You can see that some of those cars are a little bit modern, but that was built in 1951. And that's where I went to the dentist many times and almost died at the dentist a couple times. In those days, they didn't have no anesthesia. You'd be a 5-year-old person, and I was ready for the Japanese after that, I'll tell you. Here's Texatawka, 1951. Look at that. Look at the old cars in there. That picture must have been taken right after, you know. Today, I'm in a bowling league at the Texatawka lanes, and I don't think the lanes were built then, but you know where it is. It's in Texatawka. Here's a picture also of Westwood East. That must be right down by Louisiana and Cedar Lake Road. And that was 1954. And then Knollwood Plaza. That was a big deal. I was getting to be bigger now, and they said there's a new place down called Knollwood Plaza. And look at all roads lead to Knollwood Plaza. There's always free parking. Big deal, isn't it? We have schools. Now we're into my element here. Between 1950 and 1968, 9 schools were built. But it was the 50s that really exploded. Now, get a load of this statistic if you can. Just think of yourself as a city manager or a person living in St. Louis Park. In 1952, there were 171 seniors in high school and 1,118 kids in kindergarten. What would you do if you were the superintendent of St. Louis Park Schools and saw that? Huh? I'd say, we got work to do. You know, I just saw this statistic as long as I've been with the society, and that still amazes me. Not that I would have thought much of it at the time, but if I was a city planner, I would have said, what are we going to do? You know. So here's what we went. We built schools. Remember Brookside, Lenox, and Elliott? Then in 1950, they built Fernhill. I went to grade school at Fernhill. There it is on top, I think. Then I always forget about this school because it was torn out. Park Knoll in 1952. And then the one I remember very vividly because it changed the course of some of my girlfriends that I was trying to, in other schools, they built Ethel Baston. And you know where Ethel Baston is, right on 100 and Minnetonka Boulevard. That's a big deal, folks. That's a lot of schools. 1954 and 55, we got a problem, and they would start to build the senior high school. where my sister graduated. She was the first graduating class there. Now listen to this, and I didn't realize this. The high school would be the largest construction project in Minnesota since World War II. That's quite a statement, folks. It had the largest, at one point, probably right after it was built, it had the largest cafeteria system in the state, serving 3,000 students every day. 1956-57. That's a big deal. And there is your plot for the high school. Now, of course, it's different now. They've added a couple times at least, but that's what it looked like. That's where I went, folks. And then there was more schools. They said, well, but we're still not through, so we're going to have to build Aquila in 1956, Cedar Manor in 1957. And then they said, what are we going to do with this new baby boomers? We need a new junior high. We got a high school, but the old junior high. So they built Westwood. First class in Westwood was 59 and 60. My class was the first school class to actually go through that. There it is, Westwood. And then they still weren't done. They had to build Peter Hobart in 67 and Susan Lindgren. Some of you are maybe more familiar with those names. Now, similarly, and again, this is a hard statistic to get, but right after the war, holy mackerel, we need houses. A record 1,122 building permits were issued by city in 1950. This was the third largest number granted in the state behind Minneapolis and St. Paul. Third largest, not Duluth, not Rochester, St. Louis Park. Do we realize that that was going on? I'm sure didn't get that. Between 1950 and 56, 66 new subdivisions were recorded and 2,700 new homes were built. Between 1946 and 1954, 60% of St. Louis Park homes were built. That gives you an idea of what pressure was here at Park and in other parts of the country, I'm sure. Now, not to be outdone by that, we needed other things. So, and I remember this, the 1959 Methodist Hospital built there, right there to the left, and then later the Park Nicola Clinic. I've had some health issues, and I'm still going to some rehab, and where I'm going is Methodist Hospital. And then in 1965, Honeywell, and I think you know where that plant is, or was anyway. They built that. Industry, Honeywell, of course, we all know that name. So St. Louis Park by 1970, since 1950, remember 1950, 22,000, now the population in 1970 is 49,000. I have said this, I'll go back here and say in 1960, this is hard to believe, but in 1960 at about 45,000, St. Louis Park vied with Rochester for being the fourth largest city in the state, after Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Duluth. We were a big deal, population. 1970, you can see the new malls. Well, you can, representations of the new malls, the new schools, and the population. And then in 1970, they have business growth, Shillard Park, you remember that, and it's still there. And then the AA, that's over, not so far from Miracle Mile. Kind of off of 100 there, just south of Miracle Mile, on the east side of the road. 1980 Byerly's, you know where that is. I've been there very many times. And then, of course, Target. We used to come down in the, I guess we used to say Valley, but that's right off of 36th Street, I think. Again, east of 100, but further up towards the north. In 1990, our population is 43,787, and my notes tell me 8 schools closed. Isn't that sad in a way? I was talking to a gentleman earlier. They tore down Elliott, and I don't know if we didn't make enough noise about that, but we lost those schools have been closed, and some of them have been destructed. And I know that has to happen, but it's sad when I think about it. The Lilac Way was demolished in 1988. The creosote plant finally closed in 1972 after they figured out what they had. Took them a while. So now redevelopment. Here we have the Park Commons, 1994. And that's really kind of fixing up the old Lilac Way Shopping Center, And then you have other things like Home Depot and Costco, where they're roughly where the old Honeywell plant was. Honeywell plant closed in 1996, and Home Depot and Costco went in 1997, which is recent history for us, isn't it? Just around the corner. And then Excelsior and Grand, I think this is a neat deal. I know you go there, I go there. And you can see some of the things that, some of the old, the Red Coach Inn, Jennings, God, I remember Jennings, right? And Classic Motor Company, and of course Bunny's. Here's Excelsior and Grand then in 2002. All right, so in the future here, is that, and the West End is around what used to be Highway 12 and Vernon Avenue right there. That's an exciting place, shops, restaurants, movie theater. So now in the coming decade, we will continue, we're going to change again, we're going to grow and rebuild. More housing is being built to accommodate a rising rate in population growth, so population is coming up again. And of course, and maybe Ted will get more into this, or maybe he won't, but I'll tell you what, this new rail line that we're talking about, Southwest Rapid Rail, is going to have a stop when we get it, and when it gets to fruition in St. Louis Park. And it's going to look a lot different than the Dan Patch trolley did many years ago. I'm sure you would agree. All right, light rail is going to come. That's what it's going to look like, and it's going to stop in St. Louis Park someplace. Yeah, is it Wooddale? Thank you, sir. St. Louis Park by 2020, here's estimated. Again, different things have happened, the 49,300. You look around towns and look around the metro area, that's still a healthy population, folks. And the fact that it's going to go up a little bit is hopeful. Hopeful for new families, and the fact that we will continue to have a presence in our state. And that is about all I have to say. Thank you very much. I hope you found it entertaining. And do I have any questions? Anybody? Yeah, I have two. I'll take you first, Miss. The question was, the park that was shown along 100, which was a treasure island, are the beehives preserved? And I think that they are. They were moved from there, and they are by Nordic Wear now. So they did preserve those beehives. I had picnics there, and we used to, that's where you built the fire, for Pete's sakes, and they did have stone benches. We had two of our class picnics for Fern Hill there years ago. Good question. You had a question, sir.
Where does the name St. Louis Park come from?
Ted, you want to quickly, I remember a little bit.
I don't think there's any official paperwork that shows this, but essentially the railroad, the Minneapolis-St. Louis Railroad was coming through, and in exchange for putting a stop in what became St. Louis Park, we would name the town after the railroad. And so that first train depot was right there on Wooddale and 36th, right where the light rail station will be today, so it all comes full circle.
The question was, where do we rank in population? How big is the city in comparison with other cities? And as I said, there are larger cities now. I think we have room for growth for people, but we're not going to geographically grow. So places like Egan and Eden Prairie, even Minnetonka, are going to be larger than we are. But 49,000 is still a good-sized community. Yes, sir. The question was, is the stop where the new rail station is going to be very close to where our old office used to be? And the answer is, yeah, we used to be over. We had an office in the old train depot building.
So the original train depot was moved into Jorvik Park in 1971, and that is where the Historical Society houses a lot of our collection. And so it's, what, 100 yards from where it used to be, maybe 50 yards from where it used to be, but yeah. But yes, so you will have a rail station, and you'll be able to see the old train depot in the park from that light rail station.
The question was, the streetcar I showed, the Dan Patch line, where did it end up? At the end of Lake Street, I guess. I don't know where that was.
So you're asking a little bit where the actual street line went. It ended at Reese's at the waiting station there. That was the last stop. Yep. 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 And then kind of an angle on Lake Street until it shot towards the city. Yes.
The question was, how many square miles is St. Louis Park? And I have help back there. Apparently, it's 10 square miles. The question was, 1949, Edina Morningside had not opened yet, so where did those people go? And apparently there were some people in West Minneapolis, and the answer is they went to St. Louis Park, because Park did have a school. Again, this is this population thing. I mean, I remember in 1960 when I was talking about 43,000 people or whatever it was in St. Louis Park. I used an old almanac to find out there was only 12,000 people in Edina in 1960, which means there was not enough in your year to build a high school. Again, isn't this amazing? We don't think about what this post-war growth and how it left people scrambling, literally scrambling. Yes? The question was, I'm sorry, she was saying that even in the 30s or 39, 40, that people that lived in Edina had to go to a school, and they hadn't built one yet because it wasn't large enough, so they came to St. Louis Park because we had built up a school. Anything else, folks? Gee, you've been a great audience, and thank you for letting me do this. Thank you.
So thanks, Jim. That was great, and it's always fun each time I hear the history. I did not grow up in St. Louis Park, and I've just fallen in love with the city, and it's always so fascinating, and I learn something new each time. And on that vein, I was looking around this week, getting ready for this, and was just poking around looking for some fun stories to share with you. So you'll be the judge if they're actually fun or not. All right, so here are the 10 stories. We'll do Discover St. Louis Park, saloons, haircuts, crocodiles, gangsters, banks, streets, parks, beep ball, roller skates, and dinosaurs. So it sounds fun, right? Hopefully. So I mentioned Discover St. Louis Park because I just always find it fascinating. You go all the way back to the beginning when there was only one hotel. And Discover St. Louis Park, obviously today is our tourism board, and they are responsible for promoting all of our hotels and businesses, as well as the Historical Society. Thank you. And this is the original T.B. Walker-owned St. Louis Park Hotel, right by the train depot, Wooddale and 36th, or what is now Highway 7. And it had 8 or 10 rooms. The Kellers were the family who owned that. And earlier in the presentation, you saw Doc Brown. He was a barber. He actually had a shop just to the left of this building after this was built. And he married the daughter of the proprietors of the St. Louis Park Hotel. So that was our first foray into hospitality, if you will. Saloons in those hotels would often be a saloon, at least in the wet years. And here's Werner's Saloon, which was inside one of the hotels. And this is on Brownlow, right by where Step is today. There were several hotels in that area. And yeah, you can see the spittoon on the floor, probably some discoloration on the floor from the mist spittoon. So that's always a fun picture to see. And so speaking of saloons, from 1893 to 1919, when Prohibition came in, they voted every year whether we should be a wet or dry town. And so this little chart is showing you the years we were dry and the years we were wet. And when we started, T.B. Walker, again, the money behind a lot of the growth in the early years, he was adamant that we would be a dry town, and he kind of threatened to not do some development if we voted wet. And the decision around being dry or wet were not necessarily on moral grounds. It was more of if we're dry, people are going to just go to Minneapolis and drink and come back and cause all sorts of trouble. So you might as well stay here and drink here. But you see some of that flip-flopping. In the years when we were dry, a saloon would just not sell alcohol, supposedly. But the business would remain. Sometimes they'd have a curtain that they would cover the bar like on Sundays and stuff like that. All right, haircuts and crocodiles. We mentioned Doc Brown. Here's a picture of Doc Brown in his barber shop. Doc was a common name for barbers at that time. And he was in the Walker Building. The Walker Building is still standing as our oldest building, oldest commercial building, at least in St. Louis Park. And so he had his barber shop there. He also had just a shop to sell goods. And in the back, he had the pool hall. We saw this picture earlier. Have a few pool tables. Cannot have been very well lit. So I would imagine some very errant balls. The funnest story that I've always keep coming back to is the crocodile that sat in his window in the 30s. So someone sent him a baby crocodile in the late 20s, and he didn't know what to do with it, so he put it in the window of his shop. And a fact that I did not know was that a crocodile will grow 2 inches a year. And so he had it for at least a decade, so that thing got pretty big. This picture is his son, Ben Brown, in 1929, holding the alligator. I always forget the difference between the alligator and the crocodile, so I apologize. You will not be getting a zoology lesson today. Brief touch of gangsters. Jeannie knows all about this in the back, so she'll correct me if I'm wrong, or if you have questions, she'll answer. But Tommy Banks was a known gangster in the 30s, and he made millions on selling alcohol and owning various restaurants. One of those restaurants was McCarthy's. McCarthy's sat on right where 394 is and about Louisiana, that general area. And so he was the funder behind McCarthy's. So that's kind of one of our touches of fame with the gangster life. Bank collapse. So we saw this actually in the aerial earlier, but I love this building. I wish it was still standing, but it was our first bank, and it started in 1914, and it sat right next to Central Community Center, or the high school at the time. So at that time, that was kind of the heart of St. Louis Park. You had the Walker Building down the street, the Hamilton Building, the new high school was just built. And so this was a very prominent location. But it came into some trouble. Started in 1918 when it was sold to a guy named Schaefer, William H. Schaefer. And to cut the story short, he did what bankers sometimes do. They were doing some funny things with the money, and they eventually got shut down. And that was, 1919. They closed the state bank. So it wasn't there very long. And the post office was in the back. Eventually, when the bank got kicked out, the post office became the main tenant, if you will, of the building. And then it was damaged in a tornado and eventually was torn down. And today it's just, it's a little facility building for the school district. So again, I wish it was still standing there. All right. Street names is always fun. Our alphabet system started in 1933. Before that time, the streets were very confusing. We had a little bit of order. There's some letters and numbers, but we had 9 different streets named Summit at the time, so that makes things challenging. And a lot of streets would only go for a few blocks, maybe the blocks that the developer wanted to name, and then later it would change names. So it was just very difficult. So eventually in 1933, we managed to change all the street names. And so the strategy was to take the system from Minneapolis, the alphabet system, starting with France. And you probably know our first alphabet doesn't really have a theme, but the second alphabet are all states or Canadian provinces, and then the third alphabet had to be historical or patriotic names. Speaking of names, we'll talk about parks real briefly. Here's our city. We have 35 neighborhoods in our city, and within those 35 neighborhoods, there's 52 different parks. and it makes up 11.5% of our land in St. Louis Park. So we're a very park-centric city, as you probably well know. You know, many of the parks at that time, as Jim was going through the population boom, all those developments, the developers would usually set aside land for a park. And our first park, which is today called Jorvik Park, at the time, many years was called Bandstand Park, again, right near where our train depot sits today. But that was just one example of all the various different names. So I just always find it fascinating, all the different, who are all these people that these parks are named after. And so there are some that were landowners, like Carpenter, that family donated the land to the park. Sometimes they were just adjacent owners, so people just knew that name as that area, like Hannon Lake. Many civic leaders, Ainsworth, Jorvik, I already mentioned, Nelson Park, and Wolf Lake are one of our more recent, Wolf Park. And then some are just some interesting people that were named after. This is a fun little story about beep ball. If you don't know what beep ball is, it is baseball for the blind. And so a softball has a transmitter in it that gives off noise. It beeps to aid in playing. But what I found fascinating, this is John Ross Field in Texatonka Park. And John Ross was the president of the Braille Sports Foundation, and so they were a big backer of beep ball. And so at one time, St. Louis Park was known nationally as kind of the best facilities for beep ball. And John Ross, by coincidence, I guess, this is a picture of him on the right with Babe Ruth. And when he was 11, he conducted the last interview of Babe Ruth's life. So that was published, that picture was published in the Minneapolis Morning Tribune in June of 1948. I think that's a pretty interesting little tangential connection to Babe Ruth for St. Louis Park. And then going to end with the roller garden. So the roller garden started in 1930. It was called Pastime Arena, and it was a riding area, a riding ring, if you will. And so this was one of the only pavilions other than the state fairgrounds for horse shows like this. In the 50s, it became a tennis facility, but all the birds flying inside and the glare from the windows apparently did not make it a very good tennis facility. And then in the 70s is when it got turned into what we know today as the roller garden. You see a pair of skates there, great palms on it. And then there's the story of the famous dinosaur. The dinosaur was bought by the owners at the Minnesota State Fair, and it was brought over to the roller garden. I guess for years it would kind of roll around on a cart, or until someone eventually got hurt, of course, and then they decided to put the dinosaur on top of the building and painted it very different colors. My understanding is the high schoolers then figured out how to get onto the roof, so then they just took the dinosaur down and stuck him inside. And so when you go to the roller garden and you see the little green dinosaur, you'll know why he was there. So those were our 10 little fun stories to finish up our afternoon here. I want to again thank everyone for coming. If there's any further questions, we can certainly take those. But thanks again for coming. Yes.